Now, if there was one word that I could use to describe the iPhone 14 Pro Max in all of its entirety, that one word would be tolerable. Now, according to the Oxford Dictionary, tolerable means fairly good, and it can also mean mediocre. The following synonyms for tolerable include passable, adequate, alright, and the one that I feel describes it the most is good enough. And that's always how I felt about the 14 Pro Max in its entirety. It's nowhere near the greatest iPhone to ever exist, but it's also not the worst iPhone ever. It's just good enough to the point where you'll be happy you have an iPhone, but what makes it inadequate at times is its many problems regarding the software experience, and these problems can make or break your experience as a whole. So instead of me going on and on about how inadequate or adequate the iPhone 14 Pro Max can be, I wanted to share my experience to help you decide whether or not it's actually worth that $1,200 price tag. Now, the most important piece of hardware that you can have on a phone is battery. You literally cannot do anything if your phone is dead all the time, and luckily for the 14 Pro Max, that wasn't a problem at all. During my 2-week analysis, I was averaging about 6 to 8 hours of on-screen time a day, which I know is way too much time on your phone, but we'll look at my very unhealthy habits later. Getting back to battery, there's only a handful of times where I can truly say that I needed to turn on power saving mode, and that's where I would get heavy work days on my 14 Pro Max. Like whenever I got 10 hours doing things like scripting at work or filming multiple videos. The Pro Max supports 30-watt fast charging, which I had minimal problems with. And the reason that I say minimal is because it really does charge pretty fast. And by pretty fast, I mean 75% in 55 minutes. And I just know that Apple has the resources to provide us with an iPhone that can support 45-watt fast charging, which is way more suitable for a phone of this price. And also, speaking of usage, I was never the type of person to cut any corners to save battery, and my iPhone had all-day battery life, so most of the time I was charging it overnight. Now, during my time of using the Pro Max, I had 5G on, my brightness was on manual, and my always on display was always on, and I'm using every power heavy app as much as I can. And again, I only use power saving mode a handful of times, meaning that if you are someone who mostly charges your phone overnight, you should be good no matter how much you use your phone. And now the last thing that I wanted to point out after 8 months of use was the battery health. My battery health is at 95%, which is pretty good, I guess. My iPhone 12 Pro went down much faster, so I'm going based off of that. And now something that's extremely important when it comes to your phone on a day-to-day basis is design and build quality. And ever since the iPhone 5S, Apple has always been pretty good in this department when it comes to their top-of-the-line pricey phones. The 14 Pro Max has this very rounded frame at a POV, but when you hold it, it's very boxy just like the iPhone 5S. The phone's frame complements my hand very well, and I'm holding my phone for hours a day on a daily basis, so it really helps to have a phone that's easy to carry around. Also, the rounded frame makes the phone go into my pockets even easier as opposed to my Galaxy S23 Ultra that's very boxy and occasionally bumps into the sides of my pockets along the way. Now, the 14 Pro Max also has a pretty nice weight to it. It weighs in at 240 grams, which is a tiny bit heavier than the S23 Ultra. Me personally, I like my phones to have a good weight to them. It really adds to its premium feel and makes me feel like I'm carrying around a $1,000 phone. And then when it comes to aesthetics, the 14 Pro Max has really mastered that Apple clean yet simple type of style. The buttons and ports were in the right places. The phone was big enough to add to the experience. And even using it with a case, the iPhone has always had aesthetically nice cases that become the true identity of your iPhone, so you can't go wrong with either. And now looking at the display, the iPhone 14 Pro Max has a 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR display that is easily the best on any iPhone I've ever owned. The pill-shaped notch isn't the greatest in terms of spacing when watching videos, but whenever I'm using it regularly, I found the whole aesthetic to be favorable compared to the old school notch. Everything on the display felt very smooth. I think that the 14 Pro Max mastered the balance between sharpness, accuracy, and the feeling of quality. As far as durability, the 14 Pro Max has ceramic shield on the display, which Apple claims is made with ceramic nano crystals that resist damage, but personally, I would say don't drop it on concrete because again, concrete is undefeated. Now, durability isn't the only thing that's great about the display. It's very sharp, punchy, and premium when it comes to colors, but it knows not to overdo it. The brightness is a step up from last year's 13 Pro Max. If you're outside with the 14 Pro Max, you can reach up to 2000 nits worth of peak brightness, and there are many extremely sunny days where I live, and I still didn't feel the need to max it out since the brightness was really good. And arguably, my favorite thing about the display was the 120Hz refresh rate that Apple calls ProMotion. It complemented iOS 16 so well, and I was surprised that it was able to be fast and smooth at the same time. Watching movies and content on this phone is amazing. The dual speakers creates that immersive experience when it comes to sound, and the speakers are extremely loud with very good quality. And now the last thing that I wanted to touch on when it comes to the display is the array of ways to unlock your phone. There aren't as many as the Android, but Face ID works very well, so I can't really complain. I use Face ID with my mask on, at night, in different rooms with the worst lighting, and it was reliable every single time. But I'm not gonna lie, picking up your phone every time to unlock it can get annoying, and I do wish there was a fingerprint sensor. Now, Dynamic Island is something that many people who have the iPhone 14 Pro Max don't really care about, and based on my experience with it, I would say that you stop caring about it usually within the first week of using it. The only thing that I use it for is music and sometimes the GPS, but all of its other functionalities like the timer or caller information can be clocked on my Apple Watch, which makes it even more meaningless. Now, I'm not saying it's not cool, and it can be very helpful depending on the app or situation, but overall, I don't think it lived up to its hype since it was first announced. But besides my opinions on the idea of the dynamic island, it worked very well and I didn't get any hiccups with it, but be careful because there are some people who do experience bugs. Now, before I discuss the camera, I want to go over some of the problems that I had to deal with in my 8 months of using the 14 Pro Max. Now, the first problem that I had was the extreme bugs. Now, there was a couple of different scenarios that I can go over, but I want to address the most common. Like whenever I'm taking a call, it'll randomly hang up within the first few seconds. Another very common scenario is when I'm just chilling using my phone and out of nowhere my app will just freeze on me. It also happens when I'm in a rush to show someone something, which is really annoying. Now, the next problem that I had to deal with on my 14 Pro Max was a very personal problem that a lot of people who have multiple phones deal with, and that's the wireless SIM card problem. Now, as you guys know, I change phones very often. I change between Androids and iPhones, so it always helps to just pop out my SIM card and put it into a new phone. But the problem is that for some reason, most phone companies aren't even equipped to make this process as smooth as possible. It takes way too long, I'll get a lot of failed tries, and it's just way more complicated than it needs to be. And now the last problem that I faced was very annoying when it came to the 14 Pro Max, and that was the camera focus. Now, I shoot a majority of my videos on my iPhone, but I recently stopped shooting on my 14 Pro Max because it can't focus on certain things, which is very annoying. Like whenever I'm shooting the phone, I try to show off the sides, and for some reason, the 14 Pro Max can't focus on it. So I basically just end up putting it away and using my 12 Pro instead. Now, moving on to camera, the 14 Pro Max isn't much of a beast on the spec sheet, but still produces high quality pictures. It has a 48 megapixel main camera, along with a 12 megapixel ultra wide, and also a 12 megapixel telephoto camera that doesn't fail to impress me. Something that I've realized is that compared to all of the other phones that I've used over the past years, the iPhone has always been the most realistic in terms of color. Like the colors are always toned down and you can tell that the photos aren't heavily processed. And I can say the same thing about night mode photos. They are very good. I love how it brightens everything up in the phone so that any subject is not only clear to see, but also very clean. The Pro Max's zoom photos are very good as well. I've always found the ultra wide photos to be acceptable but not great, but as soon as you zoom in more, the pictures add much more detail. I also took some pictures in different modes. You have the standard mode, which is the most realistic, the contrast mode that adds a lot of color, you have the vibrant mode that brightens up the photo, and then you have warm and cool, which makes a pretty cool filter depending on the situation. Selfies on the 14 Pro Max were the best in the smartphone market. I love how it handles my skin tone. I also love how it looks realistic while also adjusting little details, and I've always been a fan of the iPhone selfies, so this time is no different. And now the videos on the 14 Pro Max were amazing despite the minor problem that I mentioned earlier. There were many great things that caught my attention, but the overall clean professionalism stood out the most. You can shoot up to 4K at 60 frames per second. It looks really good, and even though it takes up the most space, I think that the quality is very much worth it. The stabilization was solid, pans were smooth along with brightness and contrast, and I want to give you guys some random footage that I was able to capture on my 14 Pro Max. And alright you guys, that's it for my review on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And I feel like I've pretty much said everything I feel about it. It's a good passable iPhone that you won't hate, but you won't really love either. It captures everything that you need in an iPhone, but can also deter your experience due to its nagging issues. And let me know down in the comments, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the iPhone 14 Pro Max? Let me know. And again, I want to thank you guys for watching today's video, and I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace.